British salt marshes accumulate about 700,000 tonnes of carbon a year alone. And in the top 10 centimetres of soil, salt marshes hold about 2.3 million tonnes of carbon.
Welcome to another episode of Rewilding the World. I'm Ben Goldsmith, and I'm sitting here with Angus Garbutt, who not only grew up just around the corner from me in Somerset, in Bruton, but who works for the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology in the UK, and is one of the world's foremost lovers of and experts of salt marshes. I don't know if you've ever even visited a salt marsh. I've only once spent any meaningful time at a salt marsh, which is the Great Steart Marshes Restoration Project in Somerset. But these are mysterious, strange ecosystems, liminal landscapes where the sea meets the land, where the tides come in and then go back out. They're muddy, they're strange, they have funny little salty plants that you can eat. And they're also ecologically vital, vital for wildlife, vital for us. Angus, thank you so much for taking the time to join me today.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. Yeah, thank you for inviting me.
Angus, why are salt marshes so extraordinarily special in terms of the wildlife that they have, the atmosphere that they've got, before we get onto their ecological benefits for us?
Well, I think in terms of the value, it's quite interesting. In your introduction there, you say you've only visited a salt marsh once, and yet most people in Britain and maybe around the world have heard of salt marsh, even though they haven't visited it. It's because salt marshes are in the public psyche, and we don't even know it. And there's a long history of salt marshes in literature and art. And if you think of great novels like Great Expectations, where Magwitch the murderer was hanging out and hiding on the marshes in Kent, they were dark and mysterious. And they're kind of places, these liminal places, half land, half sea, mysterious places, and the people who live there traditionally, in the past have been described as kind of on the margins of society, and they've kind of been lawless, mysterious, dark and misty places. And they featured through art and literature over time. And if you think about the kind of history of these habitats, they're kind of uncontested places. What are they, land or are they sea? And they're kind of metaphors for human emotions as well. They can be places of great beauty, wilderness, freedom, but also places of hardship as well. And that's been portrayed through literature and then through our television screens for centuries.
Yeah, I mean, there's the famous book and the film Where the Crawdads Sing, which I think set in North Carolina, which is another story set in one of these mysterious, massive salt marshes. But it's difficult to conjure in our minds exactly what a salt marsh is. We all know what a beach looks like. We all have in our minds what a mudflat looks like. How do you define a salt marsh? Like, what exactly is it?
Well, salt marshes are transitional habitats between land and sea. As you go up a kind of elevational gradient, you start in the sea, and then the tides rise and fall, and as they fall they expose mud, and if you go a bit further towards the land, salt marsh plants start to grow. And these plants, they're called halophytes, plants that are salt tolerant, and they're physiologically adapted to cope with salty water and tidal inundation. And at the lower edges, that's salt marsh mudflat transition. You've got plants like Sampha salicornia, which you might find in your local supermarket. Tasty plants and annual plants that are used in food and recipes. And they can tolerate tidal inundation probably half to three quarters of a year round. And then as you go up the elevational gradient towards terrestrial habitats, you get these more bushy, shrubby plants which can cope with tidal inundation, things like sea purslane and sea aster, cope a little bit less with salt water, but still cope with this kind of regular tidal inundation. And then you move up to kind of the salt marsh transition to terrestrial habitats. So you might get a salt marsh next to a sand dune or a grassland, or down in the southwest of Britain next to a woodland. So they're really these habitats, these muddy habitats that form behind barriers and in estuaries where the water's quiet and slack, where salt marsh plants can settle, colonise and grow and cope with salt water.
But they can kind of be dangerous as well, presumably, with the tide roaring in and roaring back out, and also, we grew up being warned about quicksand and bogs, and presumably salt marshes have areas that you can just disappear into.
Yeah. Going back to the kind of art and literature, Daniel Defoe, and he was a chronicler as well as writing Moll Flanders and Robinson Crusoe, and I think he worked for the Telegraph, and he went round, he described salt marshes as these dank, dangerous places where people would get the dengue fever and the ague and these kind of and then the mud, you disappear into the mud. So there's a general perception that these places are dangerous and you get cut off by the tides. But if you actually go onto a salt marsh, they're fairly firm. You can walk out there. Cattle graze, sheep graze, got hares graze as well. Birds nest. We've got red shank nest on salt marshes. Skylarks and meadow pipits do as well. Bees pollinate. You've got beautiful plants like sea lavender and sea aster, which need pollination by the rare moths. There's rare bumblebees as well that pollinate on there. So the perception in the public perception is that they're dangerous places, but in fact, you can walk on there, fairly comfortably. You can look at all, the beauty there. And as the tide comes in, you can see sea bass and mullet and flounder swimming through the creeks. And I have to say, I've worked on salt marshes for 30 years, and I've had a few sticky moments, and I've been stuck in the mud a few times, but I've never felt threatened at all.
Don't they say if you do slip into quicksand or into the soft mud of a salt marsh, you're supposed to paddle out on your belly? There is a kind of technique for saving yourself, isn't there?
Yeah, that's right. I've been stuck in quicksand a couple of times, but that's below the salt marsh. Once on the wash, and it's quite a scary experience. It's the quicksand is where all the water pushes into the sand, and it becomes like a mousse. And as you work along, it wobbles, and then you drop into it, and then as you drop in, you push the water away, and it sets around like concrete around your legs, and then you wobble again to try and get out, and you drop a bit further down. So the idea then is to not keep wobbling around and going further and further into it. You kind of have to lie down. It's a wet and messy business to get out, but I've done it a couple of times and managed to survive.
I mean, in a different ecosystem type, I was up on Exmoor and was shown a trembling bog. Mm-hmm. Which is it looked like grass to me, kind of grass and moss, but beneath is deep peat, and it's kind of very wet. And there are stories of horses and carriages literally disappearing into the trembling bog, and people not even attempting to try and retrieve them because they were gone. So Angus, why have they disappeared? Because I'd like to know to what extent around the world, and specifically in Britain, salt marshes have been wrecked, and why would we bother?
So around the world, about half of our salt marshes have disappeared, and in Britain, about 85% of salt marshes have disappeared. We've got about 5.5 million hectares of salt marsh globally, and in Britain, there's about 45,000 hectares of salt marsh in existence. And just to say, sort of, if we're talking globally, salt marshes are kind of the bread between, if you think about a sandwich with mangroves sort of in existence around the equator. Sort of mangroves are in the kind of equatorial zone, and salt marshes grow in these temperate zones, so the northern and southern hemispheres. And especially in the northern hemisphere, industry, drainage for agriculture has been a huge to the detriment of salt marsh. So reclaiming salt marshes for industry, agriculture has been one of the main drivers of their decline.
So does that mean effectively shutting the sea out? So you go to a point out on the salt marsh and you build a bloody great wall, and then the sea can't cross the wall, so the salt marsh dries out and you can turn it into whatever you want, industrial or agricultural land. Is that what we've done?
Yes, yeah, exactly. If you think of the southeast of England, if you think around Norfolk, Lincolnshire, the Wash area, you've got these huge sea defences which basically keep out the sea from flooding Norfolk. If you took those sea defences down, the sea would come into, around Cambridge and Peterborough. There's a system that's been going on since the 1700s and even before that of draining salt marsh, where you would put a wall at the foot of the salt marsh, between the mudflat and the salt marsh, and let that embank the salt marsh and stop the tide coming in, and rainwater would flush out all the salts, and then that land that was claimed from the sea. If you think about salt marshes, they're really muddy, really full of organic material, and they've been covered in salt, so they're very fertile. And there's low sort of parasite load in there as well, so they're really great productive land. So if you look around the kind of, the garden of England, around the Wash, where all our brassicas, at Christmas, where your Brussels sprouts and collies from, they all come on ex-salt marsh land, which has been embanked. And that's the same in the Netherlands and all around that northern coast as well. The Netherlands, we've got these huge coastal defences which keep out the sea and stop land from flooding and increase the agricultural productivity.
And what they talk about Doggerland and that space between Great Britain and Scandinavia when during the Ice Age the sea levels were far lower. Was that effectively one massive salt marsh stretching across the whole of what we know today as the North Sea, the English Channel?
Yeah, it would have been salt marsh and going into wet woodlands as well, willow and alder, carr. So you've got this great transition from marine environments to huge salt marshes, and then through to wet woodland. If you think of Boadicea and the big marshes, and that they would have sort of backed salt marshes, and you can still find those kind of habitats transitions around Britain and around the world, but in very, very rare cases these days. But yeah, it would have been one huge marshland.
So why is it a bad thing that we've shut the sea out? Because first instinct is the sea's salty water. It creates a kind of muddy, sort of interesting, mysterious, but not particularly useful habitat, you'd think. Whereas if you build a seawall, then suddenly you've got lovely agricultural land. You've maybe got land that you can rewild to terrestrial ecosystems of some kind or another. You'd think this was kind of an aspect of human progress that might not be so bad, keeping the sea at bay and reclaiming some land. Why is that in some or all cases not the right idea?
It's about what salt marshes can provide. So it's great, for food production, reclaiming salt marshes. But on the other hand, if you have a salt marsh in front of your sea defence, that salt marsh actually protects the sea defence as well. So if you think you have a kilometre of salt marsh in front of a sea wall, as waves and storms come over that salt marsh, the vegetation and the salt marsh dissipates the wave energy, takes the energy out of the system, which means that the sea wall doesn't have to be as big or doesn't erode as quickly. So salt marshes have this kind of value towards protecting agricultural land or railway lines or urban areas. So they act as a kind of buffer between land and sea. And they also, with our kind of net zero targets, climate change at the moment, salt marshes are really muddy and they store massive amounts of carbon as well. So if we're thinking about sort of net zero targets, we've got in around Britain, British salt marshes accumulate about 700,000 tonnes of carbon a year alone. And in the top 10 centimetres of soil, salt marshes hold about 2.3 million tonnes of carbon. So you've got this really important coastal defence value for salt marshes. You've got this really important carbon storage and accumulation value of salt marshes. There's also a really important fisheries value to salt marshes as well. So fish... commercial fish like sea bass, another fish, flatfish and mullet and various other species. And even in the north of Scotland, where we've done some research, we found cod and whiting in salt marshes there. Fish breed and live their lives in the marine environment, but their juvenile fish come into the creeks as the tide rises. Fish swim into salt marshes and they're productive environments, so there's lots of organic matter, which means there's lots of bugs, lots of little beach hoppers and spiders and beetles, and come and feed on that. And also by these young fish coming into the salt marshes, they're protected from big fish who eat them and predators. So you've got this sort of important fisheries value as well. And then the general biodiversity. I mentioned earlier breeding birds, redshank are declining really quite, severely in terrestrial habitats. They breed in salt marshes around Britain. And there's the aesthetic value as well. If you think, we're talking rewilding and, what's a natural habitat or a semi-natural habitat? Most habitats in Britain are managed. If you go to a salt marsh, you've got these huge, vast areas of sky, sea and marsh, and there's something really sort of thrilling and cathartic about being in a wild environment which is unmanaged and wild, not tamed by human beings as well, and so that kind of aesthetic value, on top of everything else, makes salt marshes, sort of incredibly valuable. And I think, and it's underappreciated as well. I think that side of it.
Yeah, we read every day in the papers now about different kinds of flooding. And one of the kind of starkest is the coastal erosion and the rising sea levels and increasingly dramatic storms. And we've built along lots of our coast, and we're farming against lots of our coast. And those farmers and those homeowners want to protect their homes and their farmland from the sea. And so they call for higher sea defences. And I think the salt marsh restoration movement is proposing something different, which is, actually remove the sea walls, let the sea in, and build new sea defences much further inland. So in other words, sacrifice farmland in order to create a much more resilient defence system for everything behind the seawall, towns and houses and so on, maybe better farmland. So is that the thinking behind the amazing Steart marshes that I visited? Can you tell that story? Because just after I left Steart marshes, I was told that a delegation from South Korea had showed up, were going to show up, and to learn about salt marsh restoration as a cost-effective way of building sea flood resilience into their coastal landscapes. And it seems like Steart marshes is kind of a global inspiration for salt marsh restoration and flooding resilience. What's the story there?
Yeah, well, they kind of, up to, certainly in the UK and kind of globally, up to the late 1980s, the reclamation of salt marshes for agriculture was kind of standard practice. And then in 1992 in Rio, the Convention of Biological Diversity, basically international governments agreed to no net loss. So let's protect these priority habitats for their biodiversity value. And the thinking around salt marshes at that time was, well, we have to protect salt marshes. It's a sort of it's an internationally agreed principle. But at the same time, there was concern about sea level rises, the maintenance costs of sea defences and the value of the land behind. So if you think about the cost benefit, protecting sea defences, building up bigger or higher, or setting them back inland, managed realignment it's called, realigning the sea defences back inland, creating that extra wide buffer of salt marsh and then protecting the land behind. We can't hold the line forever in certain places, especially where the value of the land isn't as great as the cost of the sea defence itself. So there's a cost-benefit analysis to do there. And there's about over 70 of these managed realignments in the UK at the moment, where holes have been knocked in the wall, agricultural land's been flooded, and salt marsh has been created for all those extra benefits that I've just talked about. And there's another kind of movement, again, just at the moment, with beneficial use of dredged material. So there's another way of building salt marsh in that the dredging industry around the UK and globally dumps millions and millions of tons of sediment into the sea every year, taking out of our estuaries and keeping shipping channels open. But there's a new movement now, and really developing well in the UK, about dumping that mud back on the coastal margins instead of putting it at sea, and building salt marshes that way as well. And there's a big programme in the Solent in the south of England at the moment to do that, and again additional coastal and sea defence and all the extra values it protects.
So effectively creating new salt marshes in places where perhaps there may never have been salt marsh. But of course, the coast is a constantly changing thing. But with human intervention, you're creating new salt marshes in a new zone.
Yeah, you'd have to create them in the same zone. Salt marshes can only exist in areas where the tidal energy is low, because salt marshes are made up of fine sediment. So when mud settles out, it's a fine sediment habitat, as opposed to, say, Chesil Beach or big gravel, high energy coast where you've got big pebbles. So you create salt marshes where salt marshes have been in the past. So the Solent, there's been salt marshes there, but they've been eroded away through land reclamation, through sea level rise, through increased storminess. So it's about recreating salt marshes where we've lost them in the past.
This episode of Rewilding the World is very kindly brought to you by Uni, that's UNI, the world's first nature-friendly line of luxury body care. We've all heard about the harm that sun cream does to coral reefs, but it's not just sun cream and it's not just coral reefs. Well, Uni makes plastic-free, nature-friendly essentials like shampoo, conditioner, hand wash, and even natural deodorant, all full of nourishing ingredients such as seaweed kelp, aloe vera, and olive oil. We've been loving our Uni products, but don't take it from me. Here's my wife, Jemima.
Yes, I really love them. They're such clean and nourishing products. The microalgae body oil is so good and really smells amazing.
You can find Uni products at Space NK or at weareuni.com. When I went to Steert, I saw, how you see those starling murmurations in the Somerset Levels and in Rome and other places, and you see the birds kind of flying as one, like a huge genie in the sky, a kind of great pattern. It's one of the most extraordinary sights in nature. Well, I saw seabirds and wading birds behaving like that at Steert. So I saw a murmuration of knots, which just blew my mind. These landscapes are incredibly important for migrating birds, aren't they? We're on the East Atlantic Flyway, which is one of the great bird migratory highways of the world. There are birds moving up from Africa, up through Europe, up towards Iceland and the northern parts of Europe. And presumably our salt marshes are a vital recharging point for many of those bird species.
Yeah. Things like, it's an interesting story. If you're a knot, for example, and you're breeding up in the tundra, the Russian Arctic tundra, you have to decide as you're migrating south for winter as the ice comes down, do you stop in the cold northern, northwest Europe, and or do you fly further south to Africa? And the reason why half of the populations of, say, knot or other wading birds stop and keep feeding on the mud flats in, say, the Eastern Flyway, is that they're really productive. So as a small bird, you have to eat lots and lots in a cold winter in Britain, and they're really productive habitats. So salt marshes have this kind of outflow of nutrients into the system. So knot wouldn't feed in the salt marsh. They feed on bare mud flats, on worms and bivalves. But salt marshes are connected to mud flats in terms of, they're very rich. They produce a lot of organic material. That organic material moves through the tides into the mud flats. Worms digest that organic material, creates lots of, big worm and bivalve beds, and then the birds feed on that. So there's a really important piece in salt marsh as well, in the whole system, about connectivity. And we're really trying to push this idea where maybe in terrestrial rewilding, you could talk about landscapes. Everyone understands what a landscape is and what landscape connectivity is. You create woodlands and rivers and hedgerows, and they're all connected. But a seascape, this concept we've been trying to push over the last 2 or 3 years, and we've written about it and talked about it, connecting coastal habitats. So if you think fish might lay their eggs in a seagrass bed, and then these young fish might go and feed in a salt marsh, or if we've got an oyster reef, and the waves might go over the oyster reef, the reef might dissipate wave energy and then create slack conditions for sediment to fall out and then salt marshes to build. And at the moment, our coastal habitats are so depleted. There's no functionally viable oyster beds in the UK at the moment. They're just natural oysters. They've basically disappeared, fished out, disease, various things. Seagrass as well, there's only tiny patches. So we don't really have a functioning seascape in the UK or globally, really. So you've raised a really good point there. Salt marshes don't feed on the salt marsh, but the salt marsh feeds the mudflat, which then feeds the invertebrates, which feeds the birds. Seagrasses don't exist adjacent to a salt marsh, but the fish move across both habitats. So it's that kind of connectivity, that seascape concept, and putting resource and energy into creating fully functioning habitats, of which salt marsh is part, is really important. In the same way as with landscape, you just can't see it if it's under the sea, and that's why it hasn't been kind of at the forefront of people's minds until recently.
So now you've got the emergence of such things as re-oystering. I'm going to be chatting on the podcast with a member of the team at the massive oyster restoration project in New York. Billions of oysters being reseeded across the other side of the Atlantic, and we got our own re-oystering projects here in west coast of Scotland, for example. And sea-wilding is a term I came across recently, where kelp forests and seagrasses are being restored. And you've described so beautifully the interconnectedness of all these ecosystems, which is something that I think has been kind of a new idea that perhaps had been overlooked by ecologists and by conservationists and biologists previously. And there's this growing understanding that we need to restore contiguous nature across a bunch of different habitats in order for it to all work optimally. So Angus, you work with the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. Can you just tell me a little bit about that organisation? What do you do, and what are your goals in terms of stimulating the restoration, in particular, of salt marshes in the UK and worldwide?
Well, the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, UKCEH is our acronym, and we've got a long history going back to the Nature Conservancy in the 1940s. The Nature Conservancy was formed to basically manage national parks, and it kind of evolved over the 40s and 50s, and then I think it was the 60s there was a split from the Nature Conservancy into a research arm and a sort of a conservation management arm, which today we know as Natural Resources Wales, Nature Scot, Natural England. And then the research arm was the Institute of Terrestrial Ecology, Freshwater Ecology, which has now evolved into UKCEH. And I think with some of the great work that's been done in the past, say, around DDT and Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. One of our former colleagues, Norman Morey, was flying over the Great Lakes with Rachel Carson, and she was describing this great ecological disaster. And he came back to Britain and made the connection between DDT and killing this pesticide that was sprayed post Second World War to really kill off bugs and increase our arable production, to going up the food chain. So bugs were eaten by small mammals and voles, and those were eaten by raptors, so kestrels and other birds of prey, for example. And they found that DDT didn't kill birds of prey, but it made the egg shells thin. So birds of prey laid their eggs, but the eggs cracked as they were sat on. And from that set up the ecotoxicology department, the predatory bird monitoring scheme, and which we still run today. And that research basically got DDT banned around the world. And there's other work we do on GM crops, looking at the difference in the environment in different, how GM crops impact the environment. And we do lots and lots of work, all sort of the original work on restoration and reseeding, what seed mixes and what density do you have to put down to recreate grassland, was the original sort of restoration we did in the UK. And now we work on rivers, freshwater, coasts, mountains, and really provide the scientific evidence that underpins policy making, decision making, and practical making in restoration.
Yeah, and all of that's going to be so important in raising the level of political ambition. Well, the understanding of the importance of these ecosystems, and especially salt marshes, which is the topic of our conversation today, among politicians, and therefore the ambition. I mean, the Conservative MP for the area in which Steart Marshes is found described the project as Disney for ducks, a guy called Ian Liddell Granger. But by the way, exactly the same guy who is perfectly happy subsidising Disney for sheep across our national parks, but Disney for ducks no good, and that's all the while. The project is a kind of international inspiration for novel nature-aligned flood defence and carbon sequestration. It's one of the environmental restoration projects that we can be most proud of in this country. So I think getting politicians to understand better the importance of such ecosystems is going to be really important. And then, of course, Sophie Hunter, who's the talented artist and wife of the actor Benedict Cumberbatch, has got her new project, which is how you and I actually met, which is to use arts and creativity to expand salt marshes in the public consciousness, and had that extraordinary event in Venice. And the Venice salt marshes, of course, are terribly depleted, but there's now the beginnings of an effort to restore them and a recognition of the importance of those salt marshes in defending Venice itself. So it feels like we're entering an era of love for salt marshes, Angus, and the work of the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, and also the Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust, who took me to see the Steert Marshes, and who've received a bunch of funding now from Aviva, the insurance company, specifically for restoring salt marshes. These things feel to me kind of emblematic. It feels an exciting time for the kind of ecosystem that you love. Angus, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me about salt marshes. Thanks for everything that you do. I hope we can go and visit one together this spring or summer.
Great. Thanks, Ben. Yeah, really enjoyed that. Thank you.
That conversation with Angus makes me think back to my school days reading Great Expectations, or more recently, Where the Crawdads Sing. Salt marshes are amazing ecosystems that we really don't experience very often, and they're vital, protecting us from flooding, nursery grounds for fish, sucking out carbon from the atmosphere. Angus's work is vital, and his passion is so amazing. I've loved this conversation, and if you enjoyed listening to it as much as I enjoyed making it, please give us a like, a review on whatever platform you use for your podcasts. It all makes a big difference. Next time, I'm going to be talking to a wildlife celebrity, Beth Pratt from California. Beth is the director of the California branch of the National Fish and Wildlife Service in America, and has played a vital role in building up coexistence with quite difficult wildlife. There are cougars living at the center of Los Angeles, one of only 2 cities in the world to have big cats living among people. Join us. It'll be great.
You already know that this isn't about one species. It's about systems, interdependence, collapse. And yet, wild salmon, one of the clearest indicators we have, are vanishing fast. Their decline signals something deeper, something more dangerous. I'm Jim Murray. I host The Last Salmon. It's not a side story. It's the biodiversity story that everyone like you should be listening to. Season 2's out now.
One of the best ways to support rewilding is to go and visit rewilding projects on the ground. My friends at the European Nature Trust have asked me to tell you about a series of coexistence adventures that they've put together. They're designed to give you the best chance of seeing Europe's most iconic species: bears, wolves, lynx, and so on. All of these are on the rise in Europe because of rewilding projects. These trips are hosted by expert guides and conservationists, and most importantly, the European Nature Trust is giving half of the revenues directly to the foundations working on the ground to restore wildlife. I'd love you to check out these coexistence adventures at the European Nature Trust website.